All right, so let's start with talking about memory and what it is. So we know that memory is the ability for us to retain information and retrieve that information. And your book calls that storage and retrieval. So that allows us to remember things that we have learned so we can have that information when we need it. And we know that if we didn't have our memories, it wouldn't be good. We wouldn't know anybody, we wouldn't know anybody, we wouldn't have retained that information about the world. Every language would be foreign, and basically every person would be a stranger. And every task would be as if we were doing it for the first time, and we wouldn't even remember things about ourselves. So we would have no idea where we were, who we were, and what we were doing. And that's one of the most unique things about how our brain works is how unique our memory works. So we talked about three different stages of memory. When we're bringing this all up, we can talk about encoding, storing, and retrieving. So encoding is where we take information that we're learning and we process it in the way that allows us to bring it into our memory. And that can be short-term memory, but more likely we're talking about when what we're really talking about is encoding. And when we talk about long-term memory, which we'll be talking about that in more detail in a little bit, but this can include things about the environment, how we're feeling, and our thoughts about things. And we can all store this as memory. So then, when it comes to storage, storage is the ability to maintain that information for us. It's for us to be able to use it when we need it. Researchers used to think that it was the hippocampus that was the only thing involved in learning and memory, but we now know that storage actually occurs all over the brain, and our ability to maintain that information and access it to it later is one of the critical parts of our memory. So then that access is the retrieval portion of this. And this is our ability to take information that we've stored away. So we previously encoded it and stored it and then bring it back into our minds, into our short-term memory or working memory in order for us to be able to work with it. So what I want you to do is I want you just to think about it for a second. Can you think of anything that you do that doesn't use memory? So that's a really hard one because a lot of things we do, even if they're motor skills, involve memory. So the thing is you wouldn't be able to play soccer or play sports. That's just one, a couple examples. But when it comes to soccer, the dynamics of soccer, knowing how the ball is going to move, depending on the position of your foot and what angle your foot is at, what kind of shoes you're wearing, where you're hitting the ball, that's all based of our memory. And there isn't much of anything we could do or name that doesn't actually use some sort of memory. So now let's talk about how we store memory. And we talked a little bit about this, that our ability to maintain information over time is how we store memory. And your book talks about something called multi-store model of memory, which is basically just that there are multiple storage places in memory, but each one of them has their own duration and capacity. So the multi-store model of memory basic it basically proposes how information moves through us, gathering it from our senses all the way from short-term to long-term memory. So let's start with sensory memory. This is part of the first part of the multi-store model. And in the sensory system, we can hold information from seconds to milliseconds, or I should say milliseconds to seconds. And this depends on which sense it is. So you can see that an image is iconic. So things that we hear stay with us for about 3 to 4 seconds, and things that we touch stay for just less than a second. We don't know how long that is, and it depends on where it is. So like a touch on us, like someone touches our back or something like that, or we touch something. Now the capacity for these sensations is huge. We can hear, we can see, we can feel many different things, but they have a very limited duration. So again, iconic, archaic, and haptic are what we're talking about when we're talking about visual and touch memories. And we're gonna move now. Now we're gonna move from short-term memory, which is the next stage. And this we hold information very briefly while we're processing it. and while we're using it. And this could be like seconds. So 10 seconds up to less than a minute. And it depends on how we use this information and how long we continue to think about how that information, about the information and process that information. And that information we're talking about earlier that comes from our senses. So things that we see, hear, feel, taste, whatever comes from all those sensory information, and holds it for a limited period of time. With that information, the vast majority we just forget. We don't actually need to store it, or we can transfer it into long-term memory, which is the other option. So that would be our goal, is to transfer it to long-term memory. And let's talk about long-term memory. So long-term memory is our ability to hold things for hours or years, or potentially longer than that. It's really interesting that there isn't really a limit on our long-term memory, or none that we found. It's basically limitless. And the better our cues are, the better we are at remembering. Because there's more paths that are made in our brain to that memory. So the more connections we can make to a particular piece of information, the longer we're going to be able to store it. So again, looking at that multi-store of memory and thinking about our ability to store. And so again, capacity and duration, you can see those sensory memories have limited amount of duration, but large capacity. And short-term has actual limited capacity, and we're going to talk more about that. So what we can do is what's called rehearsing to keep it in our short-term memory. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the short-term memory section. And we can process it further and get to long-term memory. And in long-term memory, this could be very limited capacity, limited duration, just like a few minutes to a long time. Even lifelong learning is included in the multi-store model of long-term memory. So we know that these stages are distinct from each other, and we often talk about neurological evidence that points us to understanding how something works. And we can look at the individuals in certain situations and have a good sense of how that is going to impact their memory. So we know that people who have amnesia, which is the inability to remember things either in the past or inability to make new memories, have intact short-term memory by and large. And so that means that they can retain the information that they currently have in their mind as long as they're continuing to process it. And we know that people who have Parkinson's have an impaired short-term memory, so very intact long-term memory. So they can remember things that have happened to them in the past, and they can encode new information, but their capacity in the short term is limited. And we know people with Alzheimer's have impaired short-term memory and long-term memory. And this tells us that long-term memory and short-term memory might be separate from each other, or largely separate from each other. Because you can see situations in which someone has both, someone has neither, and someone has one but not the other, and vice versa. So neurologically, we can say that each of these stages of the multi-store model are distinct from one another. So I've given you as much information as I can about the sensory memory aspect of the multi-store model. And now we're going to go into short-term memory and think about that a little bit more. And then after that, we'll talk about long-term memory in the next part of the lecture. So within short-term memory, we know a few things. One, that it's limited capacity, and we know that short-term memory has both limited duration, but also limited capacity. So unlike the sensory memory, which has seemingly limitless capacity and extremely short durations, now we're talking about potentially up to a minute in terms of duration, but very limited capacity for how much we actually can hold and process that at one time. So common knowledge tells us that we can hold about 7 plus or minus 2 items in what we call we call verbal short-term memory at any one time. So what we see is that people have varying capacities, varying abilities, and if we are really factual about it, we have maybe 4 categorical items that we can talk about. Digits and things like that have slightly more, but let's just try this. So I'm going to read some numbers to you, and I want you to repeat them back to me after I read them. I'm going to read a sequence, and then you repeat the sequence back, okay? You ready? Try to see how many of these numbers you can repeat back to me at one time. All right. Okay. 6205. What'd you do? Okay, next sequence. 97348. Okay, next sequence. 49231. Okay, let's try the next one. Ready? 8630748. Repeat that back. Okay, so that's 7 digits. It might be getting hard at this point, but let's try going up two more. 910249661. All right, you still with me? All right, let's go on to the next one. 239718420. Go ahead and repeat that. All right, let's try one more. 73092871145. Okay, so that last one actually had 10 digits in it, which is the same as a phone number. And so it is possible for us to remember phone numbers, but usually we group the sets of numbers together to make it easier for ourselves. Like the area code becomes the one thing in our mind. So let's try another one to see if letters are any easier than numbers. All right, are you ready? P, T, A, F, B, I, D, O, G, C, I, A. Try repeating that. All right, good try. That was 12. Now this time I'm going to show you what I said and see if you see any patterns in it. Some people might have gotten this one, and think about why they might have gotten it. It's probably because it forms meaningful subunits. So we have PTA, FBI, DOG, and CIA, right? So those are meaningful subunits. And that's called chunking, which is essentially where when we're grouping things together to make it easier for us to store information and hold more in our short-term memory at one time. For example, so I'll give you an example. So you'll see the first list of digits that would be really hard to remember. But if you could decode them and see that it actually says dog, cat, fish, rabbit, right? It's just so much easier to process. And you can probably remember dog, cat, bird, fish, rabbit as one thing, or something to keep in your short-term memory. So now let's talk about short-term versus working memory. And you probably heard me even in this series of lectures talk about working memory, and it's largely interchangeable with short-term memory. That's true, but not quite true. These two things are very related to each other. They're both talking about limited term ability to remember things, but there's some distinctions. So short-term memory is what holds our information for about 30 seconds or so, whereas working memory uses that short-term memory, but also uses long-term memory and manipulates the information. So it allows us to take things out of our long-term memory and some new information and add some new information to it and process it again. So let's talk a little bit more about working memory. Working memory is basically an enhancement to the ability to just remember things in the short term. It actually allows us to make those pieces of information memorable, and therefore it makes it easier for us to transfer them to long-term storage. So they say that working memory is part of memory. It actually contains three different sections to it, such as the individual spatial sketchpad, but essentially that allows us to maintain a kind of processing of the information, visual and spatial information, and things that we hear, and then we can encode it into a long-term memory and retrieve it back into working memory. There's also something called the working memory span, where we can think about how many things we're able to keep in working memory, which is different from our ability to keep things in short-term memory. So what keeps our information in short-term memory longer? How can we actually keep it around? So you know you've done this many times before. You've done rehearsing probably, and that's if you hear something that's important to you, you want to make sure you remember it, and you repeat it over and over and over again. So we'll do that to keep that in our short-term memory. And so going back to the digits thing, so you hear a phone number and you want to remember it later on. So you just it's just rehearsal is just repeating it over and over and over again in your mind. So some things actually make it into your long-term memory, like your parents' phone number. But most things they have to have some kind of meaning in order for us to get it out of just our short-term memory. And so we have multiple mechanisms for keeping information in our short-term memory, all depending on those working memory units. And so I'll start with a phonological loop that allows us to repeat verbal information. And the visual spatial sketchpad allows us to see mental images and visualize, making sure whatever it is we just saw, we can hold in our mind. And then there's the central executive, and that helps us think and engage with short-term memory to manipulate it into whatever we need to do with it. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is long-term memory, and there's no data that says that there's a limit to the duration of long-term memory. And we can pretty much put long-term memory into two different forms, explicit and implicit. And for explicit memory, that would contain semantic memory, and those are just things that we know that are facts. Semantic memories would include like the presidents, the last 10 presidents, or the capitals of states in the United States. So if we switch over to episodic memory would be personal experiences. These would be intentional things that we remember, and this is also known as declarative memory. And this is heavily involved with the hippocampus part of the brain. The other form of long-term memory is implicit memory. And that can be divided into three different sections, which is procedural memory, priming, and classical conditioning. So if just kind of go back what I was saying before, explicit memory is factual knowledge and personal experiences. Like I mentioned, the last 10 presidents, capitals of states, and it involves intentional and conscious remembering, also known as declarative. And it involves the hippocampus part of the brain. Remember, so it was episodic and semantic. And then if we go over to implicit memories, that's also called non-declarative memory. And that's memory without intentional recollection or awareness. And it's measured indirectly through the influence of prior learning of behavior. And there is quite a few different systems in the brain that are involved. And so one example that would be like riding a bicycle. It just involves so many different systems when it comes to motor memory and learning the different steps to the process and all of that. So just remember that implicit is non-declarative, involves many different systems, and measured indirectly to the influence of prior learning on behavior. And like I mentioned before, there's three different types of implicit memory. There is procedural memory, priming, and affective conditioning. I think I mentioned classical conditioning before. Both are related, but so procedural memory is a type of implicit memory related to the acquisition of skills. And priming is the increased ability to process a stimulus because of previous exposure. And then affective conditioning is there's some kind of emotional relationship to something that was neutral. So one example of this would be there is one study with a woman with amnesia. And so there's kind of two parts of this study. The first part was the woman was supposed to shake, a man had walked up to her and to greet her and held his hand out to shake her hand. And when she shook his hand, she got shocked by a buzzer. And then after some amount of time, they met again. And remember that that woman had amnesia. So she met again and she didn't remember meeting that man, but she did remember the shock. So the man had held out his hand to shake her hand. And she said she never met him before, but said that she didn't want to shake his hand because when I shake hands, sometimes I get shocked. So this one example is a very interesting, unique situation that shows the effect of conditioning in the brain. So one phenomena that's important to talk about is the serial position effect. And we'll see here that there is a serial position curve. And just to sum things up, it when we're memorizing things in a list, it involves both short-term and long-term memory. And our recollection of those things depends on where items are on that list and the position of the word in the list. So let's say that you went on a tour and saw a bunch of different buildings. And based on this phenomena, we'll remember things that we saw in the first few buildings that we saw, and then the last few buildings that we saw. And kind of the things in the middle would be less certain. And if we look at the percentage of recall, if we look at the percentage of recall for this graph that we're seeing, if given a list of 20 words, we will often remember the first words with about 50% accuracy and the last words with 75% accuracy. But just similar to that example I mentioned about the buildings, the middle part of the list we don't remember very well at all. And they're retained in a very limited part of our long-term memory. And then with the short-term memory, remember that the last words because they're the most recent to us. So we're still holding on to them in part of our working memory, in part of our short-term memory. So we can just think about how memorizing can use both. Just remember that short-term and long-term memory are both used when it comes to certain kinds of memorizing. And the different components that are involved, there's different components that are involved in long-term memory. Now that we know the different forms of memory or components to that multi-store memory we talked about earlier, we're going to talk about forgetting. So we'll talk about forgetting, which is the inability to remember things, and we're going to talk about why that is and why it happens. So amnesia is a loss of memory due to damage or due to trauma. And there are two types of amnesia that we can talk about. We can talk about anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. Anterograde amnesia is something that stops us from being able to move information from our short-term or our working memory into our long memory. And that means that we can't make new memories. So it prevents us from making new long-term memories. It prevents us from those being created. And I put a picture here of a movie, a really great movie, directed by Christopher Nolan, and it's called Memento. And in that movie, there's a character who has anterograde amnesia. And I'll talk about retrograde amnesia. So retrograde amnesia is moving to the past, and that means that access to previous memories that we've made are broken. And it doesn't mean that those memories don't exist anymore. It just means that our retrieval pathways to gather those memories are broken, and we're not able to remember them or recall them. So another example to bring up is a man named HM, and HM was an auto mechanic who suffered from seizures, and the seizures were so severe. He had severe epilepsy, and they're so severe that they're causing a lot of problems. And he couldn't do his work because he would frequently have full body, full brain seizures that would cause him to fall down and have a seizure, which obviously not be something that's good in an auto mechanic shop. Anyway, he was talking to doctors about this, and this was in about the 1940s. And they didn't know exactly where the problem was coming from in his brain, but they did know that there's one area in his brain that was particularly active. And this region, they pointed out that this region was about a finger-sized sliver on each side of his brain, and he gave consent to go ahead with a procedure to have that portion of the brain removed. So unfortunately, the doctors didn't know what that portion of the brain did. It effectively eliminated his ability to form new long-term memories. So he retained his old memories and retained his short-term memory. And he also kept the same intelligence. He understood what was happening around him. He still had a good personality, similar to what he had before. The problem was that he could not make new memories. And he was able to interact with the researchers who were studying him, but he could not remember them in the long term. And as you can see on the right hand of the image, the regions of the brain that were missing. And you can see that there's two components and where their hippocampus was removed in HM's brain. So another case that's similar to this is of Clive Waring. And Clive Waring had an inability as well to form new memories. He had some issues with his short-term memory and remembering things from the past. And the things from the past he didn't remember. So there are components of his long-term memory or past memories that he has. So he has anterograde amnesia and some limited retrograde amnesia as well. And so there's some things that are intact, but limited in his working memory. So we're going to watch an example of Clive Waring, and I'll just play that in a moment.
One man is consigned to live entirely within the present, with terrible consequences. Clive Waring has the worst case of amnesia ever known. 20 years ago, he lost his memory, and now his wife, Deborah, is the only person he recognizes.
Clive really only has less than 30 seconds memory, and sometimes it's as little as perhaps 7 seconds. It's as little as a sentence.
I'm going to see your sister, Adele. Her daughter's got married recently in New Zealand. And so they're having a party.
Funny how the ladies acquire different title when they get married.
Do you know who I'm going to see tomorrow?
Buckingham Palace?
No, really guess.
I don't know.
You don't know? Adele.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why I'm going?
No.
She's having a party at her house tomorrow.
It's her birthday, isn't it?
No.
No.
Do you know why?
No.
It's to do with her daughter.
Oh, I see.
Do you know why her daughter's having a party?
No.
Guess.
No, I don't.
She's just got married.
Oh, I see.
She just got married in... Do you know what country she just got married in?
No, I don't.
In New Zealand.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
The sentence he is in, he will probably have forgotten the sentence before. You ask him a question and he'll give you an answer, but while he's giving you the answer, he's already forgotten the question. That's how short it is.
I'm going to see your kids tomorrow.
You want to see my kids?
Yeah, your children.
What are they up to now?
Do you know what they're up to now?
No.
Guess what you think they're up to.
No idea, I couldn't guess. I don't know what their O-levels were. They hadn't got an O-level last time I was conscious. So I didn't know what possible thing they could do, did I?
No.
No, I couldn't possibly guess.
Where do you think they are?
No idea. I don't know where I am.
No.
All he has is void behind him.
It's been like death. I've never seen a human being before, never had a dream or a thought. The brain has been totally inactive, day and night the same. No thoughts at all. And as far as I'm concerned, the doctors have been totally incompetent. I've never seen a doctor the whole time. Oh, look, it's come. Oh, you're wonderful.
That's a very musical kiss. I'm dizzy. I don't know which part of the room I'm standing in.
Can we?
So after watching that, a few things I wanted to think about. The first thing would be, how would you explain what's happening with Clive and why he was able to retain memories of Deborah? What do you think are those possible reasons for how he's still able to play the piano? And then think about the different components of where those go in memory and why he still might have access to those memories. It definitely makes you appreciate the memory that we have, the fact that we have that ability, and not to take those things for granted. So up to this point, we've talked about the components of memory, and we've talked about forgetting, and now we're going to talk about consolidation and a little bit about making memories meaningful to us. So consolidation is the process by which memory gets stored, and it gets worked into other information that's stored within our brain. So it's kind of it's kind of integrated into the brain. And this happens through a series of processes. There is a localized consolidation that happens, and this localized consolidation happens in tandem with long-term consolidation. And I'm just gonna briefly talk about this consolidation that's happening. It happens on a cellular level, and it happens while when we're reliving or thinking about those experiences that we have. So the first thing to mention is that it's time dependent, which means it happens after the event has occurred. And as you can see here in the picture, you can see that there's a neuron, and look at the end of the neuron. And at the end of the neuron, there's these terminal buttons that we've talked about in their lectures. And so this is one of in the picture, there's a terminal button, and it's going to release a neurotransmitter, and it's going to flow across the synaptic space, the gap between the neurons. And before the memory has been formed, and that's before the memory has been formed and before consolidation occurs. And there's just a few of these receptors that you see in the picture in green to receive the neurotransmitter from the neuron. And after this consolidation has happened, you can see that many more receptors and lots more neurotransmitters are being released. And one thing to just remember is you don't need to know all of these facts, but just remember that this process happens on a cellular level. Anyway, by having basically more neurotransmitters, there's more ways the neurotransmitter can interact into different points. And with a neuron, in a series of neurons, a chain can form, and it means that the process is going to happen faster and then be stronger. And there are two pieces that we can consider when we're looking when we're thinking about how memories are formed. So this consolidation is a process for integrating information into our existing knowledge. So that's the process, and it's biologically mechanistic. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's a biological mechanism that happens after experiences have passed, and we gain more neurotransmitter and more places that neurotransmitter can react in the neuron, which means faster and more intense reactions from the next neuron in the chain. So the process just becomes stronger and stronger. And that's the process of consolidation. We know that sleeping really helps consolidation, and consolidation isn't something we think about. It just happens. And we do know that sleeping does help consolidation. You can see here that there's a study where they had where the participants had learned some initial information, and they were tested on the information at 10 a.m. and then one day and then at 10 p.m. The same day. And as you could see, that performance was not great. But then they had a chance to sleep and come back and were tested a third time, and the performance significantly increased. So we know that sleeping helps with consolidation, and one of the ways we know that happens, or one of the things that happens during sleep, is that the brain gets cleaned. The brain gets cleaned by cerebral spinal fluid that's flowing around the brain. So this goes on, it has like these little fingers that go in essentially in a scrub out. Sounds weird, but an example of this, or a way to put this, is that the spinal fluid will go in and scrub and clean up the brain. And if you I guess that helps you have a mental picture of it. And naps help with this, but just being asleep in general is a really good thing for your brain. And it leads to stronger memory, consolidation, and performance than anything else. So if you had a choice between, um, so let's say that you've been studying for an exam and you have a choice between pulling an all-nighter and cramming the whole entire night or getting some sleep. It might be more helpful to study for a while and then maybe sleep for a little bit, because sleep does help with consolidation. We can also talk about the levels of processing or the amount of meaning that is in the processing that we do to get new information. And we could be learning something at a very shallow level. And so if we're just trying to like memorize a list of words, we can think about things that they rhyme with. Um, and anything that's based on sensory characteristic, like how it looks or sounds, we have increased occipital lobe activity because we're looking at them, or we're hearing them, and we're looking at them, and or using the temporal lobe because we're listening to them. And that's a very shallow level of encoding. And we don't learn a lot from that. What researchers have found that when we want to have something with deeper encoding, we're more likely to retrieve the information. So deep encoding is relying on the meaning of the event. The item that you're trying to learn, it's just thinking about like a deeper level about the meaning and connecting it to things that we already know. And so let's say we're connecting past experiences and past memories. And when we're doing that, we're creating more pathways. And essentially, you're just like making more connections to that memory, to that information. And then you're more likely to retrieve it. So one thing to think about is if you really want something, if you really want to remember something, try to make it about yourself. That's one pathway. And if you make it about something you already know, that's a second pathway. And you just keep on going and adding more and more pathways to this process. And another thing they find is that if you judge words by their meaning and think about their meaning, you're much more likely to learn a list of words than if you just think about whether they rhyme with something. And this process is called elaboration. It's a process where we basically create connections between things we already know and new things that we're learning. And we see that in sight encoding, just by how something looks and how something sounds, and then by semantic encoding, which is the meaning. So semantic is the meaning of the word. You can see that there's a greater interaction in deep encoding tasks than semantic coding, than either sight or sound. And I mentioned this a few times, but it's even better to make it about something meaningful that's about us, about yourself. And the brain is really, really good at knowing things about ourselves and making personal connections. So the more likely we can reference something to ourselves, the more likely we're going to remember it. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I'm having you do those discussion connection assignments in your class, because it draws parallels between remembering things about ourselves and the course content. So everything in psychology, I believe, applies to us in just so many different ways. And if you think about how you can connect the information with something you already know, that's going to be a really good way to be able to reinforce memories and help you with learning. Okay, so that's a look at consolidation and deep coding and deep processing. And from here, we're going to go and talk about other elements within memory. So philosophically, we can say that we can't retrieve the exact same memory twice, which is a very interesting way of thinking about memory. And that's the reason why the very act of remembering is constructive. So the very act of thinking about something, so you might be thinking about a friend and thinking about something that happened to the both of you and recalling that memory. And then what happens, even when we just think about something, our perspective has changed on it because time has passed, because we've gotten older, because we have different experiences. Maybe our mood is different from when it was before. And the memory is actually changing every single time we access it. Every time we think about it, every time we recollect something, it's essentially a new experience because it comes with new thoughts, new feelings, new context, everything along those lines. So the ability to reconsolidate our memories, to think about them again and process them again, makes them adaptive and highly flexible. And it allows us to update them with information and with new information that we've received. So we know that memory is constructive, and we frequently use reconstruction of what happened and think about inference. We try to infer something based on our memories if we learn new information. So these beliefs come from our memory. So if we think that they come from our memory because we're reconstructing at the time, it means our memories can always be revised and they can always be changed. And that leads to potential misinformation. And misinformation of things it can be really problematic, particularly, well, there's lots of different examples, but maybe thinking about eyewitnesses when it comes to eyewitnesses who see crimes. Um, that would be a situation would be pretty problematic if you can't depend on an eyewitness on accurate information. So misinformation is the idea of decreasing accuracy of event-based memories that we might have because of information that's provided to us after the memory has been created. So when we get that information, when that's provided to us after the fact, we actually edit our memories with this new information that could be wrong. And therefore, the memory is going to take in and incorporate this false information. We know that people who vividly imagine misleading information are more likely to integrate that into their original memory. And if you ask them about to remember something, to think back to a time, and you create a very vivid image for them to think about, it can actually incorporate that the misinformation into their own memories. And I'll give you an example of that. This is called imagination inflation, and basically it means that when we imagine misleading things, we get a boost in our confidence about that information because we're picturing it in our minds. And if we can picture it, we feel like it's happened. Even if those things were non-existent, even if they did occur, it could lead to new and false memories. And false memories can be created in individuals, even if the memories are committing crimes, those could be potentially falsely created in individuals. And there's two types of memories that we have. We have gist memories, which are kind of like global aspects. They're long-lasting, they're durable, but they are just general sense of an event, of what event happening. As opposed to verbatim memories, where the details tend to be less durable, and it's like recalling parts of an event, and we remember specific parts of the event, but we don't remember exactly what happened, um, and what the order of events were, the timing, who was there, those kind of components to it. So those details are verbatim part of the memory, whereas it just is the overall sense of what happened. So the verbatim kind of memory tends to go away and be easily manipulated. A good example of this was a study that was done in the early 2000s, and what they did was they got baby pictures or childhood pictures, and so when the child was between 5 and 8 years old, they got family photos of them, and they used these photos to create a fake image. You can see here in the slide about a hot air balloon ride, and that their parents, whoever was pictured with them, supposedly took them on. And they presented this photo. So they presented this photo to the people in the study. And they said, see, you went in this hot air balloon when you were a kid. And you could see for this study, about 50% of the participants actually created a complete or partial false memory about the event that never occurred. And it was just entirely Photoshop. So obviously the participants didn't know that this image was made up. Um, so 50% of the participants believe they actually had gone on the hot air balloon, and they actually created more details in the story. And the participants believe they actually had gone on a hot air balloon and created more details. So for example, they might have said that on that day that it was windy, even though that the information that was provided to them was totally false. So some things to consider, to think about is why are long-term memories with virtually limitless duration and capacity are so prone to errors. It is really interesting that our long-term memory can hold almost um yeah, it's almost unlimited. So I just wonder and I want you to think about like why is that the case? And then even with that limitless capacity, why are we so prone to those errors? A lot of researchers have different ideas about this. One thought to bring up is if our memories were built to actually capture the past, they do not work very well. And we forget things all the time, from the answer to a test question to whether we locked the front door when we left home. And this suggests that the function of memory is not just to reliably record the past, but rather to prepare us for an unpredictable future. Just kind of going back to that idea that our brains are highly flexible and adaptive. So maybe it's some kind of advantage in our evolution. Anyway, wondering if you agree or disagree. It is definitely interesting to think about. So the next part of this is ways to retrieve the past. So what are some ways to do that? We're not always able to retrieve the information we store in our memories. Obviously, there's things that come up where we just, for some reason, they don't come to mind. They're in the back of our head, and we can't we can't exactly get everything that we want. There's challenges around that. And there's no definitive measure of what's stored in memory. It's always influenced by how we retrieve previously learned information that impacts that. So the way that we learn the information could potentially help or hinder whether we're able to retrieve that information in the present moment. And that is recall. So be able to recall different things. So accessing information from memory without any cues to aid your retrieval. And one example of that would be an open-ended essay or short answer question. Those are a little bit difficult, those are a little bit more difficult because you have basically you don't have a lot of cues to gather that information. And so you're kind of depending solely on the way that you learn information. So what we find is that when we don't have retrieval cues, it can be very difficult for us to remember information and the information we need to learn. It's harder and it's just harder for us to pull out those pieces of information. So you can see here on this graph, there are words that have to be studied, and the participants had to learn them, and either they got cues for them or they didn't. And you can see here that there are 12 words, either cued or not cued. And when there are 24 words, you do much better when there's something like there's some kind of retrieval practice, retrieval piece of information that's going to allow you to fill in the blank for the type of question and basically allow you to help pull the information out. And then there's 48 words. And obviously, a participant would do much better in the cued situation than a non-cued situation. So those hints help us order, help us um, order that information and receive and retrieve it. And that's called cue to recall, which is essentially the type of way we can get the information out. And this is where our ability to retrieve the facilitated information by just be able to use those cues to be able to recall it. So one of the final things we're going to be talking about for chapter 7 is some tips for studying. And I guess one of the big questions for this section is how can you apply this in your college life? Because these are pieces that we've been learning about cognition, and they can be really helpful for the things that we do for school. First, we need to talk about the encoding specificity principle, which means that we're able to retrieve things better when we find ourselves in the same context that we were when we studied for them or when we learned them in the first place. And so this is called context-dependent memory. A lot of studies have been done that your book had mentioned. One of the most extreme studies that looked at this was individuals who were scuba diving versus being on land. So they actually taught people in this study information both on land or underwater. And they put them in a retrieval condition where they're either in the same situation that they were when they were learning the information and in the opposite. So people were asked on land to recall information they had learned on land or underwater. And some people went back scuba diving and were asked underwater to retrieve the information to be tested, essentially on information they had learned, well, they're either on land or underwater. And what you see in the graph here is that people who learned on land did better when tested on land. And there are people who learned on land did better when they're tested on land than they're tested on water. And then conversely, people who learn underwater did significantly better when they're tested underwater than they are tested on land. So what we're finding from this study, and there's many examples of this in different studies, is this context-dependent learning. And this is one of the reasons why it might be helpful to create the same conditions that where you're studying for when you're testing. And so example of this would be trying to, if you're taking a test in one of your classrooms, trying to do some studying in that same spot at some point or many points, maybe creating environments where you are, have the same context as you were in the class, as you were studying. So that's just kind of like a dependent memory thing. And this can apply to a lot of different situations. And we're going to talk about kind of the emotional dependent memory as well. And that's called state-dependent memory. State-dependent memory is the increased likelihood of remembering when a person is the same state during both encoding and retrieval. So on this graph, it shows two different time periods. First, when there's information that was encoded, and then when information was supposed to be retrieved. And what they did is, for the study, they looked at the moods of the two different periods. So when a participant would be in a happy mood and also was feeling in a happy mood, they had a better chance of recall. And then when they were sad, and then gathering that information, and then when they were tested again, when they had to retrieve it, they were more likely to recall the test items. And then when there's mismatch, there's lower percentage of recall. The encoding specificity principle can often backfire. It's not always true. You might not have studied in the way that allows for more than one cue to retrieve the answer. There could be several other cues, depending on what you're searching for. On this slide, it talks about frequent testing. There's a lot of studies, substantial evidence that frequent testing can improve retrieval. So this is an example of one study that's been done, and it's been repeated many times. There are two types of questions that the participant might be asked: memorization questions and inference questions. So I would say this is basic knowledge and applied knowledge. So the darker color is basic, and the pink light color is applied. And you can see that there's 4 different conditions that were used in the study. The first is you read the material and think about the material while you repeatedly study. So you either did it once or you did it multiple times. You did a concept map, which is drawing connections among the concepts that you're being trained. And clearly, as you can see, this is better than just studying once. Or you do something called retrieval practice, which produces the best results in both conditions in both types of questions. And that's where you test yourself. So flashcards would be good for this. I wouldn't say that flashcards are great just solely by themselves, but you can even ask yourself a question on the flashcard, or have the answer written out on the back rather than just being for the words, or whether or not you understand the vocabulary. So there's a lot of things you could do beyond that to ask yourself more conceptual questions. That's actually one of the ways for myself that helped with studying, is like looking in the material, and then asking myself questions after I read the material and kind of testing myself. And then things that I wasn't really sure or understood, I'll kind of go back and reread them. So historically, schools have emphasized encoding practices for studying. So doing repeated studying in concept mapping rather than retrieval practice. And you'll notice that one thing that in this class that you obviously have been doing is the inquisitive assignments. And this is a testing tool. It requires frequent testing because it's going to ask you repeatedly. If you get something wrong, it'll ask you about it again. And if you get something right, it's not going to ask you about that concept again. So that's the reason why those inquisitive assignments are helpful, because that gives you that frequent testing practice, and kind of the reason why we have like 2 exams instead of one giant one at the end. So that just helps with multiple retrieval practice and helps with learning. Okay, so the next thing that's important is the spacing effect. And the spacing effect is enhanced ability to remember information when the encoding is distributed over time. This allows synapses in the brain to form robust connections and allows time for learning to consolidate into a stable long-term memory. So on the graph on the right, it shows a participant who had first learned something. And then as you can see, the amount of memory retention drops over time. But it's different if the participant is given an opportunity to review the information, then it goes back up again. And then as you can see, as the days elapse over time, that retention drops. But then once they review, it goes back up again. So when you use the spacing effect is effective because you're continually delaying that loss of memory, and that's why it's helpful for remembering content. So just a few things in summary to think about when you're with your own studying and your own learning is to encode it deeply. So make it meaningful to you. Our brain is really good at remembering things that have to do with us. So as many connections you can make to your own experience is really helpful. Like it says, connect it to your own life. That's going to be powerful. And then the retesting effect is a powerful, impactful thing for learning is continue to study, but continue to test yourself on that content over time. And using retrieval cues is really helpful. Being able to think about what context you're studying in, and think about the environment of what you're studying and how you're studying can help retrieve information. And then helping reduce stress and like kind of managing self-regulating can help that hippocampal activity. So when you do those things, you're able to reduce, if you're able to use self-regulation strategies, it helps you learn, it helps you retrieve information as well. So those reducing stress tools are really helpful. And then sleep. Remember that sleep helps consolidate information in the brain. Either taking a nap or just getting sleep after instead of doing a whole night of cramming is helpful as well. And I hope those tips are really helpful for you for this semester and beyond.